People in the Middle Ages worked hard. Everyone knows that. They tilled fields. They built castles. They spun wool. Life was often short and tough, so it is easy to think they had no time for anything else. It is easy to picture endless toil from sunup to sundown, but that picture's not quite complete. And medieval people did have leisure. It just looked different from ours. It was not a weekend getaway. It was not binge watching a show. Leisure then was woven into the fabric of daily life. It was tied to seasons, it was tied to faith. It was a necessary break. It helped people cope. It helped communities bond. Most people lived in the countryside. They were farmers. Their lives were ruled by the sun and the soil. Planting season was busy. Harvest was even busier. The winter had different tasks. There was always something to do. Fields needed plowing. Animals needed tending. Food needed preserving. Houses needed mending. Life was physically demanding. There were no machines to help. Everything was done by hand or with simple tools. This meant long hours, it meant sore backs, but the work was not constant. It had rhythms. The land dictated some breaks. Bad weather could stop work. Heavy rain meant you could not plow. Deep snow meant you could not travel far. These were forced pauses. People used them. They might fix tools indoors, they might tell stories, they might spend time with family. The church also played a huge role in their time. It ordered their days, it ordered their weeks, it ordered their years. Prayer times broke up the day. Sundays were days of rest. They were for church, they were for community. This was a mandated break. It was not just an option. It was a rule. And then there were the feast days. So many feast days. Saints' days. These holy days. These were like mini holidays. They were frequent. They gave people time away from the fields. They were a chance to celebrate. They were a chance to gather. These breaks were important. They kept people going. They prevented total burnout. Life was hard, yes, but it was not without its moments of fun. Its moments of rest, its moments of connection. The idea of leisure was there. It just wore a different costume. It served different purposes. It was essential for a tough existence. It gave medieval people a chance to breathe, a chance to be together, a chance to remember what mattered beyond the daily grind. They worked hard, but they also knew how to take a break. They had to. The yearly calendar was packed with these breaks. The church made sure of it. Many people today might think medieval life was just constant work. No fun at all, but that is not true. The church set aside many days for rest and celebration. These were called feast days or holy days. They were not optional. They were part of the law. They were part of their faith. Imagine a year with many public holidays. That is what medieval people had. There were Sundays, of course. Every week was a day of rest and worship, but beyond Sundays, there were specific days to honor saints, to mark important events in the Christian story. Christmas was a big one. Easter, too. The Pentecost, Ascension, these were major festivals. They involved special church services, but they also involved much more. A feast day meant no work in the fields, no market trading, no heavy labor. It was a day for the community. People would go to church, they would listen to sermons, they would pray. But after that, the celebrations began. These were not quiet, somber affairs. Not always. They were often loud, they were joyous, they were communal. Villages would gather. People would share food, they would drink ale or wine. There would be music, someone might play a pipe or a drum. Someone might sing. Storytellers would share tales, some were old legends, some were new jokes. And dancing was common. People danced in circles, they danced in lines, they danced with joy. But games were a big part of these festivals. Simple games, physical games, wrestling matches were popular. People would bet on who would win. Mock fights were common too. Men would use sticks as pretend swords. There was a game often called folk football. It was not like modern football. It had few rules. Many people played at once. It was rough. It was chaotic. But it was fun. It let people blow off steam. Sometimes, traveling entertainers would come to a village for a feast day. Jugglers, acrobats, musicians. They added to the excitement. They brought novelty. They brought news from other places. These were rare treats. They made the feast days even more special. These days were not just about fun. They were about community. They brought people together. They strengthened bonds. They gave everyone a shared experience. They reminded people they were part of something bigger. They reminded them of their faith, of their traditions. The sheer number of these days is striking. Historians estimate there could be 50 or more feast days a year, on top of the 52 Sundays. That is a lot of days off. It means medieval people had many mandated breaks from their grueling work. These were not just short breaks, they were full days, sometimes several days. For major festivals like Christmas or Easter, the celebrations could last for a week or more. So, while their daily work was hard, it was also punctuated by many joyful pauses. These pauses were vital. They were not just a luxury, they were a necessity. They refreshed people. They united them. They gave them something to look forward to. They showed that even in a tough world, there was still room for joy, for laughter, for shared humanity. The rhythm of the year was hard work, but it was also the rhythm of celebration. And that made all the difference. Beyond the big feast days and Sundays, medieval people still found time for fun. They did not just sit around, they were inventive. They made their own entertainment. Most of it was social. It involved other people. Life was lived in groups. Solitude was rare. So, leisure was often a shared experience. For the common folk, storytelling was a huge deal. There were no books for most people, not in their homes. So, stories were passed down by word of mouth. The grandparents would tell old tales, neighbors would share gossip, people would gather around a fire. Someone would start a story. It could be about heroes, it could be about saints. It could be about funny mishaps. Listening to stories was a cherished pastime. It connected people to their past. It sparked their imagination. Music was everywhere too. Simple instruments were common. Flutes made from wood, lutes, drums. People did not need formal training. They played by ear. They sang folk songs, they sang religious hymns. Singing was part of daily life. It accompanied work. It accompanied celebrations. It was a way to express feelings, to share culture. Games were important, even simple ones. Dice games were popular. People would gamble small amounts or just play for fun. Board games existed too. Chess was known, though it was more for wealthier people, but simpler games, like those similar to backgammon, were played by many. These games required thought, they offered a challenge, they provided a distraction. Physical recreation was also common. We already mentioned wrestling and folk football during festivals, but people also did these things in smaller groups. After a long day, young men might wrestle, or they might practice with sticks. It was a way to stay strong, a way to prove oneself, a way to burn off energy. Taverns played a big role in medieval social life. These were not just places to drink. They were community hubs. People went there to socialize, to hear news, to warm up by the fire. To escape their crowded homes, they would drink ale, they would talk, they would play games. They might listen to a minstrel if one was passing through. Taverns were places of lively conversation, of shared laughter. They were an important part of how people relaxed. Dancing was also something people did frequently. Not just during festivals. Gatherings in the evening might involve dancing. It was a way to connect, to move, to enjoy the company of others. Now, for the nobility and the wealthy, leisure looked different. They had more resources, they had more time, they did not do physical labor. Their pastimes were more elaborate. Hunting was a major activity for nobles. It was not just for food, it was a sport. They would ride horses, they would use trained dogs, they would hunt deer or boars. Falconry was also very popular. Nobles would train falcons or hawks, they would use them to hunt birds. The hunting was a display of wealth, of skill, of status. It was also a way to prepare for war. It kept them fit. It kept their skills sharp. Tournaments and jousting were huge events. These were mock battles. Knights in armor would ride at each other with lances, or they would fight on foot with swords. These were dangerous games, but they were thrilling. They drew big crowds. They were a chance for knights to show off their bravery, their skill, for ladies to watch their champions. Tournaments were grand spectacles. They were a form of entertainment. They were also a display of power, of military might. For the more educated nobles, reading was a pastime. Books were rare. They were expensive. But some had them, especially religious texts, or books of poetry, or chronicles of history. Chess was also a favorite game among the nobility. It required strategic thinking. It was a sophisticated game. Banquets were lavish affairs. These were not just meals. They were events, many courses of food, fine wines, music, entertainment from jesters or musicians. These were long, drawn-out occasions. They were a chance for nobles to entertain guests, to show off their wealth, to build alliances. Even within the church, clergy had their own forms of leisure. Reading, studying, writing were intellectual pastimes. Creating illuminated manuscripts was a form of art. And many monasteries had gardens or produced their own ale or wine. These were not always strict work. They could be enjoyable pursuits. So, while medieval life was certainly hard for most, it was not devoid of recreation. People found ways to entertain themselves, to connect with others, to take a break from the daily grind. The forms of leisure varied greatly by social class, but the human need for enjoyment, for rest, for play, was present in all parts of medieval society. It was a vital part of their existence. It kept them going. Leisure was not the same for everyone in the Middle Ages. Your social class made a huge difference. Where you lived mattered too. A peasant in a small village had a very different kind of leisure than a wealthy lord in a castle. And an artisan in a bustling town had yet another experience. Let's look at the peasants first. Most people were peasants. Their lives were tied to the land. Their leisure was tied to the land too. Their free time was often dictated by the seasons and by their physical exhaustion. After a long day in the fields, a peasant might not have much energy for elaborate pastimes. Their leisure might be simpler. It might be about recovery. They would gather with family. They would share a meal. They would tell stories or sing songs. The tavern was a vital place for them. It was a place to unwind, to talk with neighbors, to share a drink. These were communal activities. Solitary leisure was rare for peasants. Their lives were lived in close quarters. In tight-knit communities, their relaxation was often shared. It reinforced their community bonds. Their holidays were the church feast days. These were major events. They broke the monotony of farm work. These were days for bigger celebrations, for games, for feasting, for dancing. These festivals were essential. They were the biggest moments of leisure for a peasant. They provided vital psychological and social relief. Now, consider town dwellers, artisans, merchants, shopkeepers. Their lives were still demanding. Work days were long, but they were different from farming. An artisan might work in a workshop. A merchant might be in a market. Their work was more regular, perhaps less physically grueling than field labor. Their towns offered more options for leisure. There were more taverns, more inns, more public spaces. Traveling entertainers like minstrels or jesters were more likely to visit towns than small villages. Marketplaces were vibrant places. People went there not just to buy and sell. They went to socialize, to see what was happening, to hear news. Guilds played a role in an artisan's leisure. These guilds were like trade unions. They organized their members. They often had their own feast days. Their own social gatherings. These might include banquets or parades. These events helped build camaraderie among guild members. They provided a sense of identity beyond just their family or street. Townspeople also had access to organized events, local plays, pageants. These were often put on by religious groups or by the town itself. They offered entertainment and a sense of civic pride. For the nobility, leisure was abundant. They did not perform manual labor. Their wealth and status gave them time and resources. Their leisure activities reflected their power, their social standing. Hunting and falconry were prime examples. These required horses, dogs, trained birds, large estates to hunt on. They were expensive. They were time-consuming. They were also training for war. A noble's role was to fight. So, these pastimes served a practical purpose too. Tournaments and jousting were even grander. They involved elaborate armor, many participants, a large audience. They were not everyday events, but they were major social occasions. They drew nobles from across regions. They were a chance to show off, to make connections, to prove valor. Inside their castles, nobles had other forms of leisure. Reading was possible for the literate. Chess and other board games were popular. They listened to music. They were entertained by jesters or professional storytellers. Banquets were common. These were lavish feasts. They could last for hours, sometimes days. They were about hospitality, about display, about power. Noble women also had leisure. They might oversee the household, but they also engaged in embroidery or music. Or reading. If they were educated, they might play board games or attend social gatherings. Their leisure was often more refined, more indoors, unless they participated in hunting or attended tournaments. The clergy, too, had their own forms of leisure. Their lives were structured by prayer and study. But within that, there was intellectual leisure, reading, writing, copying manuscripts. For some, gardening or brewing was a relaxing pursuit. They often had beautiful churches or monastery grounds. These provided spaces for contemplation, for quiet enjoyment. So the quality and quantity of leisure time varied enormously. A peasant might grab an hour or two with neighbors after supper, or they might have a full day off for a saint's feast. A lord might spend entire weeks hunting, or hosting a tournament. Leisure was a privilege. The more privilege you had, the more varied and frequent your leisure. But everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest lord, found some way to relax, to enjoy, to connect, It was a fundamental human need, and medieval society, in its own way, tried to meet it. Why did medieval people need leisure? It was not just about having fun. It served many important purposes. These purposes were deeply woven into their society. Leisure was not a frivolous extra. It was a vital part of life. One big reason was social cohesion. Most medieval life was communal. People lived in villages, in towns, in households with many family members. Leisure brought them together. Sharing a meal, telling stories, playing games, dancing. These activities strengthened the bonds between people. They built a sense of community. This was crucial for survival. People depended on each other. Leisure helped maintain those connections. It kept the peace. It fostered cooperation. Religious observance was another key purpose. Many leisure activities were tied to the church calendar. The feast days were religious holidays first. The celebrations that followed were part of honoring God and the saints. Observing these days was a spiritual duty. It gave structure to the year. It reminded people of their faith and their place in the universe. This shared faith was a powerful unifying force. Leisure also served as stress relief. Life was hard. There were famines. There were diseases. There was war. Daily labor was grueling. People needed a break. They needed to escape the pressures of their lives. Laughter, song, dance, games. These were all ways to forget hardships, even for a short time. They refreshed people. They allowed them to return to work with renewed energy. Without these breaks, life would have been unbearable. As for the nobility, leisure had an added layer of purpose, reinforcing social order. And tournaments were not just games. They were displays of knightly virtue, of military prowess. They reinforced the idea that the nobility were the protectors, the rulers. Hunting was also a way to show off wealth and power. Banquets were about demonstrating hospitality and status. These activities helped maintain the hierarchy of medieval society. They showed who was in charge and why. Passing on stories and traditions was another key role of leisure. With few books, oral traditions were vital. Storytelling sessions kept history alive. They passed down myths, legends, moral lessons. Songs did the same. They were how culture was transmitted from one generation to the next. Leisure time was the stage for this cultural education. Leisure was also about identity. For guilds, their feast days gave members a sense of belonging. For knights, jousting defined their role. For villagers, their local games and dances gave them a shared identity. It was about being part of something specific, something meaningful. It is important to understand that medieval people did not think of leisure in the same way we do. We often separate work and leisure strictly. We see leisure as free time to do what we want, to be productive in a different way, or to itself improve. Medieval leisure was rarely about personal productivity. It was not about maximizing individual potential. Instead, leisure was deeply interwoven with life. It was integrated. It was social, it was communal, it was often religious, it was not a separate sphere. It was part of the whole. There was no concept of a work-life balance as we define it today. Life was simply life, and work and rest were two sides of the same coin. Both were necessary. Both had their place. So, did medieval people have time for leisure? Yes, they did. It was just different. It was shaped by their world, by their faith, by their struggles, and by their social structure. It was often rougher, simpler, more public, but it was essential. It allowed them to endure the hardships. It allowed them to build strong communities. It allowed them to find joy in a difficult world. Their leisure was not a luxury. It was a necessity. It was vital for their well-being, their survival, their culture. And in that way, it was just as important to them as it is to us, maybe even more so. It allowed them to be human, to connect, to celebrate, to rest. And in that, we can see a common thread that links us to those distant times. The need for a break, the need for joy, the need for connection. These things are timeless.